vediamo ora è che lo status quo continui. Ed è molto difficile vedere da dove potrebbe venire la crescita. 8 milioni di persone sono all'estero, 6 milioni sono sfollati all'interno. Molti sono coinvolti nello sforzo bellico e l'investimento copre praticamente solo le esigenze legate all'emergenza. Spero che non sia tutto cupo e negativo. C'è qualche sviluppo più ottimistico di cui può parlarci? Ecco due sviluppi ottimistici. Uno è il rimodellamento delle catene globali del valore, dal momento che molte aziende tedesche sono alla ricerca di nuovi fornitori per migliorare la resilienza delle loro catene di approvvigionamento. Stanno guardando all'Europa centrale, all'Europa orientale, ai vicini europei. E in secondo luogo, l'Europa emergente è diventata molto più entusiasta della transizione verde, perché ora la si guarda attraverso il prisma della sicurezza energetica e questo farà bene al pianeta e a tutti noi. Bene, Beata Javorčić, capo economista della BERS, grazie per aver preso parte di nuovo allo show. Crescita economica, inflazione, occupazione, tutto questo perderà rilevanza tra 2000 anni. Quindi fate un bel respiro e rilassatevi. Gli archeologi di Pompei, città fiorente del Mediterraneo, hanno scoperto due scheletri che ritengono appartenere a uomini morti a causa del crollo di un muro durante un potente terremoto. Le ossa mostrano varie fratture ed erano circondate da frammenti di intonaco e da contenitori d'acqua, il che suggerisce che stessero lavorando a un progetto di costruzione. Forse gli sfortunati erano appaltatori con un lavoro promettente o forse stavano solo sistemando la loro modesta abitazione. Chi può dirlo? Non so voi, ma queste immagini da Pompei mi aiutano a vedere tutto in prospettiva. Per questa edizione è tutto, grazie per la visione da Stefan Grobe e alla prossima.
Come rispondere all'impatto dell'attuale crisi alimentare? Il mondo è più affamato che mai. Siamo in Etiopia per vedere come l'assistenza nutrizionale salvavita del Giappone sta aiutando alcune delle persone più vulnerabili.
Prossima edizione del notiziario tra meno di 2 minuti su Euronews.
Allora questo danno un po' qui, andiamo a arrivare a lui. Vamos buttare la
Giappone al G7 il presidente ucraino Zelensky cerca aiuti e sostegno. Tra i temi sul tavolo anche l'adesione dell'Ucraina all'Unione Europea.
Bakhmut, Putin conferma la conquista russa e si congratula con il gruppo Wagner. Zelensky, la città resta nei nostri cuori. 36.000 sfollati, oltre 100 comuni coinvolti. La vicepresidente dell'Emilia Romagna, una regione bombardata. Oggi la visita della premier Meloni.
In Grecia tutto pronto per le elezioni parlamentari. Urne aperte alle 7 del mattino, ora locale di domenica. Per la prima volta voterà anche chi ha 17 anni.
Dall'Arabia Saudita al Giappone, Zelensky continua il suo porta a porta in cerca di alleati e sostegno alla causa ucraina. Al G7 di Hiroshima il presidente ucraino ha discusso dell'adesione all'Unione Europea e della futura pace con il presidente del Consiglio Europeo Charles Michel. Nell'incontro bilaterale con il cancelliere tedesco Scholz ha ringraziato gli alleati per il loro aiuto e ha accolto con favore la decisione degli Stati Uniti di consentire l'invio di jet da combattimento.
Decision that we will have all these defending measures tomorrow. We have to prepare, but anyway that is great result thanks to all the countries, to our partners.
Le decisioni prese al G7 di Hiroshima puntano alla doppia deterrenza e a contenere sia la Russia che la Cina. Lo ha detto il ministro degli esteri russo Sergei Lavrov, citato dalla TASS. Anche la Cina ha espresso ferma opposizione nei confronti del G7.
Kiev non si sbilancia, ma Mosca conferma la conquista di Bakhmut, anticipata ieri dal leader del gruppo mercenario Wagner. Lo stesso Putin si è nella notte congratulato con Yevgeny Prigozhin e i suoi uomini, mentre un comunicato del Ministero della Difesa russo parla di liberazione completa della città chiave nell'est dell'Ucraina, in cui da mesi si stavano concentrando i combattimenti.
До 25 мая мы полностью его осмотрим, создадим необходимые рубежи обороны и передадим военным, для того, чтобы дальше они занимались, а сами выйдем в полевые лагеря.
Ambigue le affermazioni di Zelensky, che ha parlato di città che resta nei nostri cuori. La vice ministra ucraina della difesa aveva poco prima parlato di situazione critica e truppe che ancora difendono alcuni complessi industriali e infrastrutture nel quadrante sud-ovest della città. E ancora allerta meteo fino alla giornata di oggi nell'Emilia Romagna devastata dalle alluvioni. Una regione che sembra bombardata, la fotografia della vicepresidente Irene Priolo che sta coordinando i soccorsi. Oltre 100 comuni coinvolti, più di 36.000 sfollati e un numero ancora imprecisato di persone ancora bloccate nelle proprie abitazioni a Faenza. A Berriceto, nel Ravennate, un elicottero che stava controllando le linee elettriche è precipitato. Fuori pericolo, le 4 persone a bordo sono state portate in diversi ospedali della regione. In attesa dei primi 20 milioni per la gestione delle emergenze che dovrebbero arrivare nel Consiglio dei Ministri di martedì, in giornata è in programma la visita di Giorgia Meloni. Lasciato con un giorno d'anticipo il G7 di Hiroshima, la Premier ha detto di dover tornare perché la coscienza glielo impone. La devastazione, le fa notare Coldiretti, rischia di costare anche 50.000 posti di lavoro a un settore chiave per l'economia nazionale, un export a 10 miliardi l'anno che reclama aiuti per continuare a trainare il paese.
Le aule di scuola in Grecia si trasformano in sezioni elettorali. Dalle 7 del mattino di domenica 10 milioni di elettori saranno chiamati alle urne per eleggere il nuovo Parlamento ellenico di 300 deputati. Per la prima volta voteranno anche i minorenni che hanno compiuto 17 anni. L'obbligo di voto, da cui sono esenti gli over 70 e i cittadini che si trovano a più di 200 km dalla sezione elettorale, prevede una pena di 1 anno e 1 mese di reclusione per chi non si reca alle urne senza un ragionevole motivo, una sanzione mai applicata finora dallo Stato. Il primo ministro uscente Kyriakos Mitsotakis è a caccia di un secondo mandato, ma i sondaggi lo allontanano dalla maggioranza assoluta dei seggi in Parlamento. Il sistema elettorale in Grecia prevede un secondo turno che permetterebbe al partito con più voti di ottenere un premio di ulteriori 50 seggi al massimo, ed è alla seconda tornata del 2 luglio che i principali partiti guardano.
La crisi climatica è la più grande minaccia mai affrontata. Le emissioni di CO2 sono ai massimi livelli di sempre. Ogni anno si perdono 1,2 trilioni di tonnellate di ghiaccio, ma il riscaldamento globale è in parte reversibile. L'Europa è orientata verso un'economia circolare per un futuro climatico sicuro.
Vogliamo essere in prima linea nel green financing.
Ognuno ha un ruolo da svolgere. Qual è il vostro?
Hello there and welcome to Bruxelles Je t'aime, your news' weekly talk show about European affairs. On Brussels, my love, we take a look at some stories that hit the headlines of late. Find out what's at stake for you and for Europe. My name is Maeve McMahon. Thanks for joining us. Coming up this week, Turkey elects, tipped as one of the most important votes of 2023. The knife-edge elections brought about no winner, and millions of Turks at home and abroad will vote again at the end of May. With so much at stake for Europe when it comes to migration, trade and geopolitics, we hear why Brussels is watching so closely. And spring has sprung in Europe, and with it some encouraging new data from the European Commission about the state of the European economy. Growth looks good in countries like Ireland and Greece, countries that a decade ago were knee-deep in debt. But with the cost of living crisis seeing the higher production costs passed on to consumers, we're asking if this economic data will make any difference to our lives. To talk about these stories and much more, we're joined here in our studio by Marisa Matias, the Portuguese MEP from the Left Group, Murat Sayrek, Professor at VUP and Brussels School of Governance, following Turkey-EU relations for 2 decades, more or less. Good to have you with us. Ricardo Borges de Castro, Associate Director at the European Policy Centre, a PhD in Turkey relations, I believe.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so we have the best, most informed people on Turkey here with us around the table, so thank you so much for joining us. Now, the Turks have gone to the polls, and they will go again, as I said, on the 28th of May. The two presidential rivals, Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, are hoping to both become president. Both have to compete in a runoff election after they both failed to win 50% of the vote. A third candidate, Sinan Oğan, took 5%. So all eyes, of course, on where his votes will go. Let's start perhaps with yourself, Murat. What do you think will happen?
Well, I guess first we need to put the results in context. I mean, the opposition candidates got 50.5%, and Erdogan didn't manage to go over 50%. This alone, I think, is a success considering especially the conditions in Turkey. I mean, we are talking about major issues in terms of democracy, rule of law, and the election was not really happening in a fair environment because Erdogan was using the entire state machinery and the mainstream media as well. And despite all this, if this is happening, I think we need to recognize that it's a major success for millions of Democrats in Turkey who have been tirelessly working day and night. I mean, the election day, the first round, hundreds of thousands of young people volunteered to secure the ballot boxes. So So this alone, I think, is really very important for the future of country. I think it's really the sound of a liberal democracy loading in Turkey, no matter what happens in the second round. That's why I think we need to recognize this, because I think in Europe, many people claim that democracy in Turkey is dead. It is not dead, and I think it's a major insult to all these people, millions of people, really hoping, and not only hoping, but really volunteering, doing something about this as we speak here today. So that's really important, I believe.
Liberal democracy unloading in Turkey. Would you agree with that assessment, Ricardo? And what do you think could happen?
What for me is significant is the high turnout. Turks like to vote. They went to the polls. They wanted to express their views about the country. As for I don't want to go back to my PhD where I had to sort of deal with many definitions of what Turkish democracy is. I think there is a process. In procedural terms, democracy is working in Turkey, and I believe that in the substance of things, there is also a lot of debate. Democracy to a certain extent is a vibrant process, but of course, we have seen the trends, and we have seen what the events of past years, that jailing of journalists, of academicians, of politicians even. So I think we need to see. Turkey to a certain, I always use this expression. It's a little bit of Europeans with Turkey is a sort of a difficult love affair. You can't live with them, but we can't live without them. And so I think these are a little bit some of the issues that sometimes come into these debates.
A little bit later, we can elaborate on that love affair, that complicated love affair. But first, let's get the view from the left group, from yourself, Portuguese MEP, and tell us how you've been watching these elections very closely and what your take is.
I think everyone, as you said in the beginning, everyone was looking with a lot of attention to these elections, and we still are, because it's for sure one of the most important elections in 2023. And that's for sure, for all the issues already raised and others. As it was said also, we knew that this election would not take place in an even playing field. On the contrary, it was said. And when you look to the data, you see that in the last month, the main TV channel, the TRT, broadcasted 32 hours of the president, of Erdogan, and just 32 minutes of the main opposition leader, which says everything about what was the type of information that people were getting. I think that from the European perspective, you said the migration issues and other issues, these are at stake, but for sure are at stake other issues. I think in particular the external relations, what was the role of Erdogan in the last years, especially, and how he was approaching Putin, for instance, how this deviated somehow, how he constructed a more, let us say, post-Ottoman approach to the political relations, external relations, than it was before. So I think a lot of things are at stake, but I think it was already a huge lesson of democracy for sure.
And of course, what's very interesting here is this, I think, is it 5 million Turkish diaspora as well based here in Europe, Murat, and many of them in fact here in Brussels. Many of them have commerce near about 15-minute walk here from the EU quarter of Brussels on a street called Chaussée d'Acht, and I was there earlier this week having a chat with them to see, were they voting, was it the talk of the town, and what way they wanted those elections to go. Take a listen.
Now that the election have been prolonged, we have to vote again. I find it a bit strange because I already voted. I already queued up. What's going to change?
For me, there's nothing that will change. I think we're exaggerating a bit, especially the Europeans.
Je me suis voté pour Tayyip Erdogan.
I voted for Tayyip Erdogan because I like him. He's like my father, my grandfather. So I hope we will have a great celebration for Turkey and Tayyip Erdogan.
Just a taste of the opinions there, and many people wouldn't speak on camera. They were camera shy, but they told me they were very much in favour of seeing no change in Turkey, that they still wanted to see Erdogan stay exactly where he was.
I would say my reaction to that, also then having lived in the country, Erdogan had also a good face. And he has lifted many Turks also out of poverty. He has provided economic opportunity, has provided social services, at least as I could see. Of course, then, with all the issues that then are associated with this, of corruption, of nepotism, all of Turkey, in a sense, it's also a very complex country. And also, I think there's another element, to a certain extent, when I was studying there, when I was doing my research, that we always had this debate whether Turkey was becoming more religious or religion was becoming more visible, because he also opened up the society to other shades of Turks that before probably were not so predominant. So I think there's also been a positive side of the story. Now, that positive side of the story has been undermined by Erdogan himself for in the last few years.
Let's bring in Murat, a reaction there to what you've heard and what you've heard exactly in that clip as well.
Well, 3 million people are voting abroad. Actually, 3 million of them are registered, but 1.5 million voted in the first round. That's something also we shouldn't miss. You rightly said there are 5 million Turks in EU countries, and actually 6 million including the Turkish minorities as well, like including in Bulgaria. And it makes actually, if you really combined, the total amount is bigger than many European countries, I think, if I'm not wrong, 13 of them. So that's already very big.
Bigger than ours, bigger than Ireland, bigger than Portugal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed. Of course, what I think matters. But on the other hand, we shouldn't, I think, make big conclusions out of this as well, because, for example, in German media, we see it very, very regularly. But also we see that, for example, only 47% of the Turks in Germany actually voted. So it means that majority of the Turks in Europe, in the Western European countries, are not actually pro-Erdogan. They're apolitical. They don't really care about what's happening there. They don't really vote. They don't even register to vote, many of them. So that part we shouldn't forget. And then there are, of course, many reasons why these people are voting for Erdogan. First of all, of course, there are some sociological reasons about where they come from. Secondly, they have all these issues about because they've always felt discriminated in Europe, and they feel like Erdogan is like their hero because he had really courage to say no to Europe and to speak up as well. But thirdly as well, because all these political Islamist movements, when the Turkey was much more secular, they were actually organized in Europe, in the European countries. Milli Görüş, where Erdogan comes from, actually, the center has always been Germany, for example. So they were much more organized, and they had this opportunity to reach out to these people in an organized way. So I think that's also one of the reasons. While we are really complaining about this, because in some countries they do, we should also recognize the fact that we also allow the political Islam to be very active in our territories for such a long time.
Interesting there, that clip, to see how much support Erdogan has in some parts of Brussels, but in others here in the EU quarter, not so much really.
Yeah, but I think what was said just now, it's quite important. I mean, the majority, or about at least half of the population outside Turkey, they don't participate. And so the turnout in Turkey is huge, but then you have this huge difference. People are not probably so attached to it. And then, of course, the type of analysis that we do, I think they don't say much to the regular citizens. I mean, when we say, okay, because what are the differences which might be at stake? For instance, we saw over 20 years Erdogan concentrating a lot of power, removing the capacity of decision from the parliament and putting everything on his umbrella, under his umbrella. And we see now as something new in Turkey, the fact that the opposition was united and you had these national lines and you engaged in minorities as well. And there's this promise of giving back to the parliament some power and make it more democratic. Okay, perhaps for this it's not so relevant. It's much more relevant for the people, I think, talking about inflation, the outcome of the earthquake and things like that. So, okay, we do a lot of high-level analysis, but we also need to take into account that for regular people, things sometimes are much simpler in terms of the analysis which is made.
Of course, but there's a lot, of course, at stake.
Of course, there's a lot of stake. At stake. I don't know. I think that some of the things will not change that much, but of course we are talking in all countries. Every time you have elections, it's really rare when you have a huge, deep transformation. So, but I think that, yeah, in terms of what is the possibilities that will be open in a different scenario and not in such a permanent tension relationship. And also, I think that the big question mark is, will it change anything, for instance, in the relation with Putin or not, and the Ukraine? I don't know that, to be honest, but I think that's one of the big question marks that we have.
Well, I mean, we're obviously speculating here because we don't have the outcome, but what could change if there was a change?
I mean, I think what would change, that would be, for me, very important, is first, and that would be my expectation, first is this point that was just made, that probably a recalibration of powers, of the system of powers within Turkey, more towards the parliament, certainly, but also, for example, the release of so many of the political prisoners that are now in jail, people that I've met that supported Erdogan at the time, 2008, 2009, and now have been put in jail. So I think this movement to release these people more, and in a sense, foster again, civil liberties, the rights of the minorities, LGBT community, women rights. I think all of these issues would be, I would say, okay, maybe it would not be sort of an overnight progress, but I think there could be change here. And this would also, and then I think we might also need to talk about that, this will also put the EU in a tight spot, because then the EU needs to approach Turkey probably in a different fashion. And if I were to be a cynic, I'm not sure that the EU is actually ready to deal with an opposition government in Turkey.
No, that's an interesting point. Murat, what's your take on that?
Well, unfortunately, it is true. I mean, for many leaders, I think, in Europe, it's not so undesirable to have Erdogan, because then you don't need difficult decisions.
You have always an excuse. I'm sorry.
I mean, we have been talking about all the democratic issues in Turkey, rule of law, fundamental rights, but I believe that all those issues, they were like very convenient excuses for many European politicians to avoid a difficult question about Turkey. So if Kılıçdaroğlu is elected, actually it would also open the Pandora's box, because then you have a big question of what do you do with Turkey, especially a Turkey moving towards more democracy, fundamental rights, and EU values. So what do you do, and how can you decide, actually, because what you can do with Turkey without re-energizing the accession process is very limited, actually.
And a very divided Turkey. Well, it brings us on, of course, to the topic of Turkish potential EU membership. I mean, it's obviously been on hold since 2018, since an EU summit declaration said that they would pause the talks. Is that something you think that could ever happen one day?
I really don't know, but I think that will depend more on the will from the Turkish side rather than anything else. And of course, there was a different approach to the subject made by Erdogan and his leadership, but I don't know. In any case, it will depend on the will of Turkish
and
people.
The focus, of course, in this town is the potential entry of Ukraine and the implications of that. Is it something, Murat, that the Turks actually want?
More and more, I guess. I think a few years ago, the support to EU membership was down to like 40%, and nowadays we see that again 65, even 70%, because people really got tired of all these policies of neo-Ottoman, like Middle East, etc. They're like, we don't want Middle East, we would like to live like in European countries. There's a strong demand, actually, because we always think that it's all about economy, and yes, economy is important, but especially for young people, I think fundamental rights and freedoms, and living in a free society, that's really important, and there's a strong demand for this.
And we all remember the trip of the former French President Nicolas Sarkozy when he was in Ankara a few years ago and upset a lot of people, saying that they will never, ever join France, doesn't want to see. What's your take on that?
I mean, my take on this is that the EU has also not been very serious with the Turks on many occasions, so and expectations had been also frustrated, right? So I think we also need to keep that in mind. But what I would say is that this strategy or this expectation that the EU thinks that it can it's better off with Erdogan than with the opposition, in the long term, this is a losing strategy. This is a losing strategy for the EU. I think irrespective of